All right, guys, so welcome to our first lecture for Living in America. We're just going to review the Constitution so that you guys can answer your question for our first mini unit, which is how just is our government? So the first thing we're doing is we're going to talk about the Constitutional Convention, where they actually made the Constitution. It's important to remember this was not America's first government. That was actually the Articles of Confederation, but it was seen as too weak. So in 1787, prominent members of the various states met in Philadelphia at Independence Hall to supposedly amend the Articles of Confederation and fix it, but in reality, they just threw it away and made a brand new one, and that's the government we have today, the U.S. Constitution. So the delegates were prominent lawyers, planters, and merchants. There were famous delegates among them, including George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton. Whenever we're looking at history, it's always important to also look at who was not there. So there were no women, there were no Native Americans, no African Americans, and there really weren't poor white men either, because generally to be seen as having status and having voting rights, you had to own property, which means you had to have money of some sort. So again, look at who didn't have a say in creating the government as well as who did. Now, the government that they created had three branches, and that was new because the Articles of Confederation only had one branch. It just had a Congress, a national Congress. And that Congress was just one house and everybody had one vote. So that created some issues because then you had states like, say, New York, which is big and has a huge population, and they had the same amount of votes as, say, Rhode Island, which was very, very tiny. So the new legislative branch under the Constitution is bicameral. It has two houses. The Senate is the upper house, and there are two senators per state. So no matter how big your population is or how small, you only have two senators. And again, it's the upper house, so generally seen as more prestigious. It has longer terms. They serve for 6 years. And you're going to see the Senate has some special powers. The House of Representatives is also called the People's House. It's the lower house. It's based on population, so bigger states have more representatives. So again, there's 435 representatives total, and this is why we do the census and why it's so important. We're in a census year right now, because that's how they count up people and that's how they distribute those representatives. So if people don't fill out the census, then you might get less representatives than you actually should have. And the House of Representatives, as the lower house, is called the People's House. It's supposed to represent the average people, and it actually has short-term limits. They're only 2 years. All right, so a bit of differences there. Now, the Congress is the first article, right? It's Article 1, the legislative branch, and it has a lot of defined powers. So they can collect taxes, very important because under the Articles of Confederation, they couldn't. And if you can't collect taxes, how do you fund anything, right? We did that preamble. We talked about, you need to have an army for common defense. You need to have, you have to promote the general welfare, all of these things. You can't do that without collecting money. Congress can also borrow money and pay debt. All right. They make the citizenship rules, so they decide what you need to do to become a citizen. And they regulate commerce, which is trade specifically between the states. All right. They also coin money, so they are the ones that get to establish the dollars and the coins and what everything's worth, what it's made of, what it's based off of. They also establish post offices. They grant patents. So when people create a new invention, right, they can say this is mine, and everybody has to, pay money if they use my designs. They created lower federal courts. So the only court that's actually made in the Constitution is the Supreme Court. All other federal courts are made by Congress, and they can declare war, all right? And they also support the Army and Navy because they have, again, what we call the power of the purse, meaning that, again, they're the ones borrowing money, paying debt, collecting taxes, so they have a lot of say over where the money in government goes. They also have power of appointment, all right? So they approve treaties, and I actually forgot to add it in here, so add in, very, very important. can't believe I forgot this. They also approve all of the presidential appointments. So we're going to say the president has the power of appointment and Congress has the power of approval. So they get to approve all of the president's cabinet picks, all of his um, Supreme Court picks, ambassadors, all things like that, as well as approving any international treaties. Okay, so it's very important. So keep that in mind. Congress has that power, and specifically, this power of approval is actually going to be reserved for the Senate. So that's why it's also considered the upper house. They get that extra special power. All right, another thing Congress can do as a whole is they can override a veto. So if the president doesn't like a law that Congress has created, they can then president can veto it, say no, I'm not gonna do this, it's not gonna go into effect. Well, then Congress, if they want, they can override that veto. It does require a supermajority, but they have that ability. They can also impeach federal officials, including a Supreme Court justice or the president. So they can do that as well. And even with that impeachment trial, right, it's going to start in the House. The House would be the one that actually says, yes, we're going to indict you, we're going to have a trial. And then the Senate, again, is the one that gets to be that judge and decide, yes, you're impeached, no, you're not. They get to be the one that would then remove the officials from office. So again, the Senate has special powers. And then again, they get to create laws, but especially any other laws necessary and proper. So they can make up laws to help them do these jobs. So if they want to collect taxes, right, and they're saying, oh, it's hard to collect taxes, they can make laws on how to collect the taxes and what the taxes go for. All right, so that's important as well. And one thing that the House can do, the People's House, so the House of Representatives, one special thing that they can do is that they are allowed to start all the budget bills. So all of the bills for like where is the money going to go, they start in the House. Right? They have to be approved by both, but they at least start in the House. So that's kind of like their special power. The second article is the executive branch, and this is obviously the one people are most familiar with. I think it's probably the easiest one to focus on because there is less people involved, right? You have 535 people in Congress, and you have the president and the vice president. That's kind of who you just focus on. So just for that, I think people really focus on this branch. And so you're going to have the president, the vice president, and then the cabinet. So the cabinet, again, the president has this power to appoint these people to help run these programs, but the Senate does need to approve of his appointments. So you have a Department of Agriculture, Commerce, which is just again like business, Department of Defense, Education, Energy, Justice, the Interior, meaning kind of all stuff within the country. I think about like national parks would go under there, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Health and Human Services, Labor, Department of State. State is actually going to be foreign countries. So that's like who we deal with when we deal with ambassadors and like diplomacy, talking to other countries. That's under Department of State. Department of Transportation, Treasury, and Veterans Affairs. So we have a pretty big cabinet. Also, one that's been added more recently is the Department of Homeland Security. That was actually only added after 9/11. So the president, he can, decide maybe he wants to condense some of these or actually make more cabinet positions and departments. They can change over time. They're not set in stone. And the president's main power, so Congress's main power is, again, to make all those laws, right? To do all of their specific goals. The executive main power, main job is to enforce or carry out those laws. Right? That's the main job. But there are other things that the president and the executive branch do. The president is considered commander in chief of the armed forces. He does, again, control those armed forces. But remember, he cannot declare war. Only Congress can declare war. He gets to maintain his cabinet to run his executive departments, like the Department of Defense and the State Department. He gets to grant pardons and reprieves, so he can actually, basically, a pardon and a reprieve is that you're either going to completely overturn somebody's conviction, like just kind of say, okay, like you're pardoned, you can get out of jail, you're good to go, or reprieve is you can lessen their sentence. And he gets to negotiate treaties. So again, Senate approves treaties, but the president gets to negotiate them. He also has the power of appointment. So he appoints ambassadors, Supreme Court justices, the federal court judges, and the cabinet members. So it's a very important job. He represents the U.S. abroad. He's considered the face of the government. And he gives a State of the Union every January, which again basically says, these are the goals of our country, of my presidency. This is what I'm doing to work on it. This is the state of our union, the crisis we're in, whatever, all the good stuff, all the bad stuff going on, and what we're going to do to try to fix it. And he gets to propose legislations. We call this like the bully pulpit, meaning that he, as the figurehead of the US, commands a lot of media attention, and he can kind of set an agenda by, again, calling out certain things, and he can introduce into Congress a bill that he wants passed or something that he wants looked at, and again, using all of his media attention, kind of focus Congress on those things. And lastly, we have the judicial branch. This was Article 3. If you actually look at the Constitution, the whole thing, again, we said it's very short. This judicial branch is especially vague, and the whole article is like a couple paragraphs long. It only establishes the Supreme Court. That includes court justices. We have 9 today, but something to note is that there's actually not like a mandatory number. That's not in the Constitution. The Supreme Court was very, very vaguely described, and Congress actually has the power to add justices, so there were not always 9. And Congress also creates all of the lower federal courts. All of these courts, though, again, they deal with the U.S. laws, not state laws. Okay? And one of the things like current events, people are saying, Democrats are saying, if Trump succeeds in replacing RBG before the election or before the inauguration of the new president, if he is not reelected, what the Democrats want to do is, if they secure enough votes in Congress, they would want to try to add more justices to sort of balance out the conservative justices that that Trump has been able to put on the court. He's put on 2 already, right here and here. And then again, if he gets another one, he would have put 3 of the 9 members of the court on, and they served for life. So that is something that the Democrats are planning if he and the Republicans are successful in replacing RBG with a conservative voice on the Supreme Court. And again, the Supreme Court's big power is judicial review. It's actually not in the Constitution. It was kind of made up. So, but this is now precedent. Now everybody accepts it. And it's this principle where the courts can declare acts of either the executive branch or the legislative branch unconstitutional. And they have this power. They can revoke state laws that deny civil rights or civil liberties that are guaranteed by the Constitution. And they can even overturn their own rulings, which you saw with Brown versus the Board of Education, which said segregation is illegal. That overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, which said segregation is separate but equal. And the big thing with the founders, they wanted to divide up power because they were afraid of tyranny. They just escaped a monarchy. They don't want one person with too much power. That's why the first government, the Articles of Confederation, it had no executive branch because they were afraid of giving someone too much power. And so when they did decide to make one, because they kind of realized it was important, they made sure that there were checks and balances. Okay? So that was really important to them. And so again, big kind of thing is that Congress has the power to override vetoes, has the power to approve or deny the president's appointments, or to approve or deny treaties. The president can veto congressional legislation. All right, for the Supreme Court, the president can nominate the judges. That's really important. And the Supreme Court, they can say, oh, something the president's doing that's unconstitutional, it's now void, or they can do the same thing to Congress. And then again, Congress also has the ability to confirm nominations to the Supreme Court. So they kind of have a say, as well as the president and who will be on the Supreme Court. And Congress can also impeach judges, remove them from office. And again, they can add or remove justices to the number of people serving on the Supreme Court. Another thing is, I forgot to mention earlier, which you guys already know, Congress, again, can impeach the president. So they have the power to remove people. All right? So lots of checks and balances here. And that's, again, meant to make sure that one branch does not become too powerful and overrun the others. And again, another feature of this Constitution, divide power. Big, big, big theme. So we're going to divide power not only between the branches, but between the federal government, the national government, and the states. So that's what the U.S. is. The idea is, think of a layered cake where you have local laws, state laws, federal laws, right? You have local governments, state governments, federal governments, but the federal government's on top because they are the supreme one. All right, so they're a little bit separate. And again, that part that says the federal is the top, most important, that is what we call the supremacy clause. Okay, it's the supreme law in the land. And really, this is kind of more advanced, but there's kind of this cake analogy with federalism, where in the past there was kind of a layer system where this was a state law, this is a federal law, and they're very separated. Today, it's kind of more of like what we call a marble cake, where it's kind of mixed in. Because, for an example, the state governments are supposed to control education, but the federal government might say, oh, well, if you want funding for your schools, you have to do this. And that's kind of how Common Core became all throughout the majority of the US. Only 2 states denied, like refused to accept Common Core. Connecticut was one, so they didn't get the funding. Everybody else then adopted Common Core, they get the funding, so technically it was a state decision, but they're kind of being influenced by the government saying, oh, I'll give you money if you do this, you won't get money if you don't, etc. So that's why we say it's kind of a marble cake federalism. And the types of powers, again, delegated powers specifically given to the national government, like you can declare war. Express powers are actually stated in the Constitution. Implied powers, not directly stated, but they still exist. They're still happening. They've been used over time. Reserve powers just go to the states, and concurrent powers are shared by the federal and state government. So just so you kind of understand, a lot of people, again, only focus on the federal government, but your state and your local governments have a lot of power over your day-to-day life, okay? So delegated, these are federal things, print money, standard units of measurement, so deciding we're going to use pounds instead of the metric system, establish post offices, make the federal laws necessary to carry out their powers, declare war, provide for an army and navy, borrow money, make copyright laws, things that states specifically get the right to do, issue a driver's license, issue marriage licenses, conduct the elections, states actually run the elections, establish local government, so cities, towns, they only exist if the state allows it, running public schools, and any power that's not given to the federal government or denied specifically to the states. But the majority of things, a lot of really important stuff, are shared or concurrent, meaning both the national and the state governments protect public health and safety, right? You have various departments of health at different levels. Like Westchester has its own, and there's a New York one, and there's a national one of the CDC. So we have different kind of public health responsibilities. Both the national and the state governments do that. They both collect taxes. New York's famous, and Westchester specifically is famous for having some of the highest, if not the highest taxes in the country. And those are then on top of the federal taxes. Both can establish courts, right? But except for New York's courts are only for New York, whereas the federal courts are for, again, if you break like a federal law. They both make and enforce laws, right? FBI is going to be the police of the federal government, whereas states make up their own police forces. They both spend money for the general welfare, decide, okay, we have all these tax money, we're going to spend it on school. Or maybe in my state, I'm going to spend it on roads instead of schools, whatever. And they both can charter banks and corporations. So that's pretty much the gist of it. Give you an overview. Feel free to review this, ask me questions if you need to. But again, the goal of this is just to understand, do we think the Constitution, our current government, is just? All right, important to kind of understand before we then go in and look at all these major issues in the US to kind of understand who has the responsibility, who has the power to change them. Thank you for listening. Hope it wasn't too painful for you.